Rwanda Genocide of 1994, planned campaign of mass murder in Rwanda that occurred over the course of some 100 days in April-July 1994. The genocide was conceived by extremist elements of Rwanda's majority Hutu population, who planned to kill the minority Tutsi population and anyone who opposed those genocidal intentions. It is estimated that some 200,000 Hutu, spurred on by propaganda from various media outlets, participated in the genocide. More than 800,000 civilians, primarily Tutsi, but also moderate Hutu, were killed during the campaign. As many as 2,000 Rwandans fled the country during or immediately after the genocide. Background: the major ethnic groups in Rwanda are the Hutu and the Tutsi, respectively accounting for more than 4/5 and about 1/7 of the total population. A third group, the Twa, constitutes less than 1% of the population. All three groups speak Rwanda more properly, Kinyarwanda, suggesting that these groups have lived together for centuries. The area that is now Rwanda is believed to have been initially settled by the Twa, who were closely followed by the Hutu, probably sometime between the 5th and 11th centuries, and then by the Tutsi, likely beginning in the 14th century. A long process of Tutsi migrations from the north culminated in the 16th century, with the emergence of a small nuclear kingdom in the central region, ruled by the Tutsi minority that persisted until the arrival of Europeans in the 19th century. Social differences between the Hutu and the Tutsi traditionally were profound, as shown by the system of patron-client ties, buhake, or cattle contract, through which the Tutsi, with a strong pastoralist tradition, gained social, economic, and political ascendancy over the Hutu, who were primarily agriculturalists. Still, identification as either Tutsi or Hutu was fluid. While physical appearance could correspond somewhat to ethnic identification, the Tutsi were generally presumed to be light-skinned and tall, the Hutu dark-skinned and short. The difference between the two groups was not always immediately apparent because of intermarriage and the use of a common language by both groups. During the colonial era, Germany and later Belgium assumed that ethnicity could be clearly distinguished by physical characteristics, and then used the ethnic differences found in their own countries as models to create a system whereby the categories of Hutu and Tutsi were no longer fluid. The German colonial government, begun in 1898 and continuing until 1916, pursued a policy of indirect rule that strengthened the hegemony of the Tutsi ruling class and the absolutism of its monarchy. That approach continued under Belgium, which took control of the colony after World War I and administered it indirectly under the tutelage of the League of Nations. Some Hutu began to demand equality and found sympathy from Roman Catholic clergy and some Belgian administrative personnel, which led to the Hutu Revolution. The revolution began with an uprising on November 1, 1959, when a rumor of the death of a Hutu leader at the hands of Tutsi perpetrators led groups of Hutu to launch attacks on the Tutsi. Months of violence followed, and many Tutsi were killed or fled the country. A Hutu coup on January 28, 1961, which was carried out with the tacit approval of the Belgian colonial authorities, officially deposed the Tutsi king and abolished the Tutsi monarchy. Rwanda became a republic, and an all-Hutu provisional national government came into being. Independence was proclaimed the next year. The transition from Tutsi to Hutu rule was not peaceful. From 1959 to 1961, some 20,000 Tutsi were killed, and many more fled the country. By early 1964, at least 150,000 Tutsi were in neighboring countries. Additional rounds of ethnic tension and violence flared periodically and led to mass killings of Tutsi in Rwanda, such as in 1963, 1967, and 1973. Tension between Hutu and Tutsi flared again in 1990, when Tutsi-led Rwandan Patriotic Front rebels invaded from Uganda. A ceasefire was negotiated in early 1991, and negotiations between the RPF and the government of longtime President Juvenal Habyarimana, a Hutu, began in 1992. An agreement between the RPF and the government, signed in August 1993 at Arusha, Tanzania, called for the creation of a broad-based transition government that would include the RPF. Hutu extremists were strongly opposed to that plan. Dissemination of their anti-Tutsi agenda, which had already been widely propagated via newspapers and radio stations for a few years, increased and would later serve to fuel ethnic violence. Genocide? On the evening of April 6, 1994, a plane carrying Habyarimana and Burundian press, Cyprian Ntaryamira, was shot down over Kigali, Rwanda's capital, the ensuing crash killed everyone on board. Although the identity of the person or group who fired upon the plane has never been conclusively determined, Hutu extremists were originally thought to be responsible. Later, there were allegations that RPF leaders were responsible. The organized killing of Tutsi and moderate Hutu began that night, led by Hutu extremists. Prime Minister Agatha Uwilingi-Imana, a moderate Hutu, was assassinated the next day, as were 10 Belgian soldiers who were guarding her. Her murder was part of a campaign to eliminate moderate Hutu or Tutsi politicians, with the goal of creating a political vacuum and thus allowing for the formation of an interim government of Hutu extremists assembled by Kolo. Theoneste Bagosora, who later would be identified as having played a significant role in organizing the genocide. The Speaker of the National Development Council, Theodore Sindikubwabo, became interim president on April 8th, and the interim government was inaugurated on April 9th.
The next few months saw a wave of anarchy and mass killings, in which the army and Hutu militia groups, known as the Interahamwe and Impuzamugambi, played a central role. Radio broadcasts further fueled the genocide by encouraging Hutu civilians to kill their Tutsi neighbors, who were referred to as cockroaches who needed to be exterminated. It is estimated that some 200,000 Hutu participated in the genocide, although some were unwilling and consequently were forced to do so by the army and Hutu militia groups. The methods for killing were typically quite brutal, with crude instruments often employed to pummel or hack away at victims. Machetes were commonly used. Rape was also used as a weapon and included the deliberate use of perpetrators infected with HIV/AIDS to carry out sexual assaults as a result. Many Tutsi women were intentionally infected with HIV/AIDS. The United Nations, which already had peacekeeping troops in the country for a monitoring mission, made unsuccessful attempts to mediate a ceasefire. On April 21, as the crisis deepened, the UN voted to reduce UNAMIR's presence in the country from 2,500 troops to 270. That seemingly incomprehensible troop reduction at a time when assistance was sorely needed was rooted in such factors as the mission's mandate, which required an effective ceasefire to be in place, and the inability of the UN to find more troops to bolster the mission, which it felt had already been stretched too thin to have a significant impact on the situation. On May 17, however, the UN reversed its decision and voted to establish a force of 5,500, composed of soldiers mainly from African countries. But those additional troops could not be immediately deployed. On June 22, the UN backed the deployment of a French-led military force, known as Operation Turquoise, into Rwanda to establish a safe zone. The operation was opposed by the RPF, which claimed that France had always supported the government and policies of President Habyarimana. The RPF had rejected the legitimacy of the Hutu extremist interim government inaugurated in April and resumed fighting then. By April 12, RPF troops had invaded the outskirts of Kigali. The RPF were successful in securing most of the country by early July, taking Kigali on July 4. Extremist Hutu leaders, including those of the interim government, fled the country. A transitional government of national unity was established on July 19, with Pasteur Bizimungu, a Hutu, as president and RPF leader Paul Kagame, a Tutsi, as vice president. The genocide had come to an end. The duration of the 1994 genocide is usually described as 100 days, beginning on April 6 and ending in mid-July. During the genocide, more than 800,000 civilians, primarily Tutsi, were killed. Some estimates, including that of the Rwandan government, are higher. As many as 2 million Rwandans, both Hutu and Tutsi, fled, most of them into eastern Zaire. The great majority returned to Rwanda in late 1996 and early 1997. Aftermath. Once the genocide was over, the country faced years of reconciliation and recovery. Trying those who were thought responsible for genocidal acts was a primary focus, as was promoting national unity and rebuilding the country's economy. Prosecuting the perpetrators. Rwanda Genocide Fugitive Poster. Rwanda Genocide Fugitive Poster. Poster of fugitives wanted for the genocide in Rwanda in the 1990s. Those accused of participating in the genocide were primarily tried in one of three types of court systems: the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, Rwandan National Courts, or local Gacaca courts. Some suspects who had fled Rwanda were tried in the countries in which they were found. ICTR. In November 1994, the UN responded to charges of genocide in Rwanda by creating the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. The ICTR was international in composition and was located in Arusha, Tanzania. The tribunal was not empowered to impose capital punishment, it could impose only terms of imprisonment. The governing statute of the ICTR defined war crimes broadly. Murder, torture, deportation, and enslavement were subject to prosecution, but the ICTR also stated that genocide included subjecting a group of people to a subsistence diet, systematic expulsion from homes, and the reduction of essential medical services below minimum requirement. In addition, it ruled that rape and sexual violence constitute genocide as long as they were committed with the specific intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a particular group, targeted as such, as was the case in the Rwandan conflict, where the Hutu-dominated interim government organized the mass rape of Tutsi women by HIV-infected men. The tribunal thus was among the first international bodies to formally recognize sexual violence as a war crime. See also rape as a weapon of war. The statute of the ICTR limited the jurisdiction of the tribunal to Rwandan leaders, while lower-level defendants were to be tried in domestic courts. The ICTR statute did not consider the official position of an individual, including his position as head of state, to be a sufficient basis for avoiding or evading criminal culpability. Military and civilian leaders who had known or should have known that their subordinates were committing war crimes were subject to prosecution. Under the doctrine of command or superior responsibility, individuals who had committed war crimes pursuant to government or military orders were not thereby relieved of criminal liability, though the existence of the orders could be used as a mitigating factor. After extensive administrative and logistic delays, the ICTR completed its first cases in 1998. In May, former Rwandan Prime Minister Jean Kambanda pleaded guilty to 6 charges of genocide and was sentenced to life imprisonment on September 4. In October 2000, Kambanda tried to revoke his guilty plea, but his motion was rejected by the ICTR. The ICTR prosecution was unable to prove that a conspiracy to commit genocide existed prior to the 7th of April 1994.113. The supposed mastermind, Theoneste Bagasora, was acquitted of that charge in 2008, although he was convicted of genocide. 114,115 Andre Gishawa, an expert witness for the ICTR prosecution, noted in 2010. What the Office of the Prosecutor has consistently failed to demonstrate is the alleged existence of a conspiracy among the accused, presuming an association or a pre-existing plan to commit genocide. This is the central argument at the core of its prosecution strategy. Borrowing from the contentions initially put forth by academics and human rights defenders. With the exception of 2 judgments, confirmed on appeal, the trial chambers have uniformly found the prosecution's proof of a conspiracy wanting, regardless of the case. 116. The power groups believed that the national radio station, Radio Rwanda, had become too liberal and supportive of the opposition. They founded a new radio station, Radio Télévision Libre des Mille Collines. The RTLM was designed to appeal to the young adults in Rwanda and had extensive reach. Unlike newspapers that could only be found in cities, the radio broadcasts were accessible to Rwanda's largely rural population of farmers. The format of the broadcasts mirrored Western-style radio talk shows that played popular music, hosted interviews, and encouraged audience participation. The broadcasters told crude jokes and used offensive language that contrasted strongly with Radio Rwanda's more formal news reports. Just 1.52% of RTLM's airtime was dedicated to news, while 66.29% of airtime featured the journalists discussing their thoughts on different subjects. As the start of the genocide approached, The RTLM broadcasts focused on anti-Tutsi propaganda. They characterized the Tutsi as a dangerous enemy who wanted to seize the political power at the expense of Hutus. By linking the Rwandan Patriotic Army with the Tutsi political party and ordinary Tutsi citizens, they classified the entire ethnic group as one homogeneous threat to Rwandans. The RTLM went further than amplifying ethnic and political division. It also labeled the Tutsi as inyenzi, meaning non-human pests or cockroaches, which must be exterminated. Leading up to the genocide, there were 294 instances of the RTLM accusing the Rwandan Patriotic Army of atrocities against the Hutu, along with 252 broadcasts that called for Hutus to kill the Tutsi. One such broadcast stated, "Someone must make them disappear for good, to wipe them from human memory, to exterminate the Tutsi from the surface of the earth." By the time the violence began, the young Hutu population had absorbed months of racist propaganda that characterized all Tutsi as dangerous enemies that must be killed before they seized control of the country. The RTLM's role in the genocide earned it the nickname, Radio Machete, as it related to their incitement to genocide. A 2014 study by Harvard Kennedy School researcher David Yanagisawa Drought found that approximately 10% of the overall violence during the Rwandan genocide can be attributed to this new radio station. Gordon Danning, a researcher with the free speech advocacy group Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, questioned the assumption of that paper that media availability correlated with media consumption. Assassination of Habyarimana on 6 April 1994. The airplane carrying Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana and Cyprien Ntaryamira, the Hutu president of Burundi, was shot down as it prepared to land in Kigali, killing everyone on board. Responsibility for the attack was disputed, with both the RPF and Hutu extremists being blamed. In 2006, an 8-year investigation by the French judge Jean-Louis Bruguiere concluded that Paul Kagame had ordered the assassination. An investigation by the Rwandan government made public in 2010 blamed Hutu extremists in the Rwandan army. In January 2012, a French investigation was widely published as exonerating the RPF, but according to Philip Reintgens, the report did not exonerate the RPF. In November 2014, Emmanuel Mugisa, also known as Emile Gafarita, a former Rwandan soldier who said he had evidence that Kagame had ordered Habyarimana's plane shot down, was abducted in Nairobi. Hours after he was called to testify at the French inquiry, he was reportedly joined a long list of Mr. Kagame's opponents who have disappeared or died. Despite disagreements about the perpetrators, many observers believe the attack and deaths of the two Hutu presidents served as the catalyst for the genocide. Following Habyarimana's death, on the evening of 6 April, a crisis committee was formed. It consisted of Major General Augustin Ndian Ndilimana, Colonel Theoneste Bagasora, and a number of other senior army staff officers. The committee was headed by Bagasora, despite the presence of the more senior Ndian Ndilimana. Prime Minister Agatha Uwilingiyimana was legally next in the line of political succession, but the committee refused to recognize her authority. Romeo Dallaire met with the committee that night and insisted that Uwilingiyimana be placed in charge, but Bagasora refused, saying Uwilingiyimana did not enjoy the confidence of the Rwandan people and was incapable of governing the nation. The committee also justified its existence as being essential to avoid uncertainty following the president's death. Bagasora sought to convince UNAMIR and the RPF that the committee was acting to contain the presidential guard, which he described as out of control, and that it would abide by the Arusha Agreement. Killing of moderate leaders. UNAMIR sent an escort of 10 Belgian soldiers to Prime Minister Uwilingiyimana, with the intention of transporting her to the Radio Rwanda offices to address the nation. This plan was cancelled because the Presidential Guard took over the radio station shortly afterward and would not permit Uwilingiyimana to speak on air. Later in the morning, a number of soldiers and a crowd of civilians overwhelmed the Belgians guarding Uwilingiyimana, forcing them to surrender their weapons. Uwilingiyimana and her husband were killed, although their children survived by hiding behind furniture, and were rescued by Senegalese UNAMIR officer Mbaye Diagne. The 10 Belgians were taken to the Camp Kigali military base, where they were tortured and killed. Major Bernard Ntuyahaga, the commanding officer of the Presidential Guard unit which carried out the murders, was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment by a court in Belgium in 2007. In addition to assassinating Awilingiyimana, the extremists spent the night of 6–7 April moving around the houses of Kigali, with lists of prominent moderate politicians and journalists, on a mission to kill them. Fatalities that evening included President of the Constitutional Court Joseph Kabaraganda, Minister of Agriculture Frederick Nzamurambaho, Party Liberal leader Landwald Ndiazingwa and his Canadian wife, and Chief or Russia negotiator Boniface Ngulinzira. A few moderates survived, including Prime Minister-designate Faustin Twagiramungu, but the plot was largely successful. According to Dallaire, by noon on the 7th of April, the moderate political leadership of Rwanda was dead or in hiding, the potential for a future moderate government utterly lost. An exception to this was the new Army Chief of Staff. Marcel Gatsinzi Bagasora's preferred candidate Augustin Bizimungu was rejected by the Crisis Committee, forcing Bagasora to agree to Gatsinzi's appointment. Gatsinzi attempted to keep the army out of the genocide, and to negotiate a ceasefire with the RPF. But he had only limited control over his troops and was replaced by the hardline Bizimungu after just 10 days. Genocidal killings began the following day. Soldiers, police, and militia quickly executed key Tutsi and moderate Hutu military and political leaders, who could have assumed control in the ensuing power vacuum. Checkpoints and barricades were erected to screen all holders of the National ID card of Rwanda, which contained ethnic classifications. This enabled government forces to systematically identify and kill Tutsi. They also recruited and pressured Hutu civilians to arm themselves with machetes, clubs, blunt objects, and other weapons and encouraged them to rape, maim, and kill their Tutsi neighbors and to destroy or steal their property. The RPF restarted its offensive soon after Habyarimana's assassination. It rapidly seized control of the northern part of the country and captured Kigali about 100 days later in mid-July, bringing an end to the genocide. During these events and in the aftermath, the UN and countries including the United States, the United Kingdom, and Belgium were criticized for their inaction and failure to strengthen the force and mandate of the UN Assistance Mission for Rwanda peacekeepers. In December 2017, media reports revealed that the French government continued supporting the Hutu government after the genocide began. Planning and organization. The large-scale killing of Tutsi began within a few hours of Habyarimana's death. The Crisis Committee, headed by Theoneste Bagasora, took power in the country following Habyarimana's death, and was the principal authority coordinating the genocide. Following the assassination of Habyarimana, Bagasora immediately began issuing orders to kill Tutsi, addressing groups of Interahamwe in person in Kigali, and making telephone calls to leaders in the prefectures. Other leading organizers on a national level were Defense Minister Augustin Bizimana, Commander of the paratroopers Aloys Ntabakus and the head of the Presidential Guard, Prote Emperanya. Businessman Felician Kabuga funded the RTLM and the Interahamwe, while Pascal Musabi and Joseph Nzarora were responsible for coordinating the Interahamwe and Impuzamugambi militia activities nationally. Military leaders in Gisenyi Prefecture, the heartland of the Akazu, were initially the most organized. Convening a gathering of the Interahamwe and civilian Hutus, the commanders announced the president's death, and ordered the crowd to begin your work, and to spare no one, including infants. The killing spread to Ruhengeri, Kabuya, Kigali, Kibungo, Gikongoro and Cyangugu prefectures on the 7th of April in each case. Local officials, responding to orders from Kigali, spread rumors that the RPF had killed the president, followed by a command to kill Tutsi. The Hutu population, which had been prepared and armed during the preceding months, and maintained the Rwandan tradition of obedience to authority, carried out the orders without question. On the other hand, there are views that the genocide was not sudden, irresistible, or uniformly orchestrated, but a cascade of tipping points, and each tipping point was the outcome of local, intra-ethnic contests for dominance among Hutu. The protracted struggles for supremacy in local communes meant that a more determined stance from the international community would likely have prevented the worst from happening. In Kigali, the genocide was led by the Presidential Guard, the elite unit of the army. They were assisted by the Interahamwe and Impuzamugambi, who set up roadblocks throughout the capital. Each person passing the roadblock was required to show the national identity card, which included ethnicity, and any with Tutsi cards were killed immediately. The militias also searched houses in the city, killing Tutsi and looting their property. Tharsis Renzaho, the prefect of Kigali-ville, played a leading role, touring the roadblocks to ensure their effectiveness, and using his position at the top of the Kigali provincial government to disseminate orders and dismiss officials who were not sufficiently active in the killings. In rural areas, the local government hierarchy was also in most cases the chain of command for the execution of the genocide. The prefect of each prefecture, acting on orders from Kigali, disseminated instructions to the commune leaders, who in turn issued directions to the leaders of the sectors, cells and villages within their communes. The majority of the actual killings in the countryside were carried out by ordinary civilians, under orders from the leaders. Tutsi and Hutu lived side by side in their villages, and families all knew each other, making it easy for Hutu to identify and target their Tutsi neighbors. Gerard Prunier ascribes this mass complicity of the population to a combination of democratic majority ideology, in which Hutus had been taught to regard Tutsi as dangerous enemies, a culture of unbending obedience to authority, and duress. Villagers refusing to kill were often branded Tutsi sympathizers and murdered. There were few killings in the prefectures of Gitarama and Butare during the early phase, as the prefects of those areas were moderates opposed to the violence. The genocide began in Gitarama after the interim government relocated to the prefecture on the 12th of April. Butare was ruled by the only Tutsi prefect in the country, Jean-Baptiste Habyarimana. Habyarimana refused to authorize any killings in his territory, and for a while Butare became a sanctuary for Tutsi refugees from elsewhere in the country. This lasted until the 18th of April, when the interim government dismissed him from his post and replaced him with government loyalist Sylvain Nsabimana. The Crisis Committee appointed an interim government on the 8th of April using the terms of the 1991 Constitution instead of the Arusha Accords. The committee designated Theodore Sindikubwabo as interim president of Rwanda, while Jean Kambanda was the new prime minister. All political parties were represented in the government, but most members were from the Hutu power wings of their respective parties. The interim government was sworn in on the 9th of April, but relocated from Kigali to Gitarama on the 12th of April, ostensibly fleeing RPF's advance on the capital. The Crisis Committee was officially dissolved, but Bagasora and the senior officers remained the de facto rulers of the country. The government played its part in mobilizing the population, giving the regime an air of legitimacy, but was effectively a puppet regime with no ability to halt the army or the Interahamwe's activities. When Romeo Dallaire visited the government's headquarters a week after its formation, he found most officials at leisure, describing their activities as sorting out the seating plan for a meeting that was not about to convene any time soon. Death toll and timeline. During the remainder of April and early May, the Presidential Guard, Gendarmerie and the youth militia, aided by local populations, continued killing at a very high rate. The goal was to kill every Tutsi living in Rwanda and, with the exception of the advancing rebel RPF army, there was no opposition force to prevent or slow the killings. The domestic opposition had already been eliminated, and UNAMIR were expressly forbidden to use force except in self-defense. In rural areas, where Tutsi and Hutus lived side by side and families knew each other, it was easy for Hutu to identify and target their Tutsi neighbors. In urban areas, where residents were more anonymous, Identification was facilitated using roadblocks manned by military, and in Interahamwe each person passing the roadblock was required to show the national identity card, which included ethnicity, and any with Tutsi cards were killed immediately. Many Hutus were also killed for a variety of reasons, including sympathy for moderate opposition parties, being a journalist, or simply having a Tutsi appearance. Thousands of bodies were dumped into the Kagera River, which ran along the northern border between Rwanda and Uganda and flowed into Lake Victoria. Consumers refused to buy fish caught in Lake Victoria for fear that they were tainted by decomposing corpses, causing significant damage to the Ugandan fishing industry. The Ugandan government responded by dispatching teams to retrieve the bodies from the Kagera River before they entered the lake. The RPF was making slow but steady gains in the north and east of the country, ending the killings in each area occupied. The genocide was effectively ended during April in areas of Ruhengeri, Byumba, Kibungo, and Kigali prefectures. The killings ceased during April in the Akazu heartlands of western Ruhengeri and Gizani, as almost every Tutsi had been eliminated. Fearing retribution, many Hutus fled RPF-conquered areas. 500,000 Kibungo residents walked over the bridge at Rusumo Falls into Tanzania in a few days at the end of April, and were accommodated in United Nations camps, effectively controlled by ousted leaders of the Hutu regime, with the former prefect of Kibungo Prefecture in overall control. In the remaining prefectures, killings grew increasingly sporadic throughout May and June. Most Tutsi were already dead, and the interim government wished to rein in the growing anarchy and engage the population in fighting the RPF. On the 23rd of June, around 2,500 soldiers entered southwestern Rwanda as part of the French-led United Nations Opération Turquoise. This was intended as a humanitarian mission, but the soldiers were not able to save significant numbers of lives. The genocidal authorities were overtly welcoming of the French, displaying the French flag on their own vehicles, but killing Tutsi, who came out of hiding seeking protection. In July, the RPF completed their conquest of the country, with the exception of the zone occupied by Operation Turquoise. The RPF took Kigali on the 4th of July, and Gizani and the rest of the northwest on the 18th of July. The genocide was over, but as had occurred in Kibungo, the Hutu population fled en masse across the border, this time into Zaire, with Bagasora and the other leaders accompanying them. Impact of the genocide on average life expectancy. The succeeding RPF government claims that 1,074,017 people were killed in the genocide, 94% of whom were Tutsi. In contrast, Human Rights Watch, following on-the-ground research, estimated the casualties at 507,000 people, according to a 2020 symposium of the Journal of Genocide Research. The official figure is not credible as it overestimates the number of Tutsi in Rwanda prior to the genocide. Using different methodologies, the scholars in the symposium estimated 500,000 to 600,000 deaths, around two-thirds of the Tutsi population in Rwanda at the time. Thousands of widows, many subjected to rape, contracted HIV. There were about 400,000 orphans, and nearly 85,000 of them were forced to become heads of families. An estimated 2 million Rwandans, mostly Hutu, were displaced and became refugees. 199 additionally, 30% of the Pygmy Batwa were killed. Means of killing: skulls and other bones kept at Murambi Technical School. On the 9th of April, UN observers witnessed the massacre of children at a Polish church in Gikondo. That same day, 1,000 heavily armed and well-trained European troops arrived to evacuate European civilians from Rwanda. The troops did not stay to assist UNAMIR. Media coverage picked up on the 9th, as the Washington Post reported. The execution of Rwandan employees of relief agencies in front of their expatriate colleagues. Butare Prefecture was an exception to the local violence. Jean-Baptiste Habyarimana was the only Tutsi prefect, and the prefecture was the only one dominated by an opposition party. Opposing the genocide, Habyarimana was able to keep relative calm in the prefecture, until he was deposed by the extremist Sylvain Nsabimana. Finding the population of Butare resistant to murdering their citizens, the government flew in militia from Kigali by helicopter, who readily killed the Tutsi. Photographs of genocide victims displayed at the Genocide Memorial Center in Kigali. Most victims were killed in their own villages or in towns, often by neighbors and fellow villagers. The militia typically used machetes, although some army units used rifles. Hutu gangs searched for victims hiding in churches and school buildings and massacred them. Local officials and government-sponsored radio incited ordinary citizens to kill their neighbors. And those who refused to kill were often murdered on the spot. Either you took part in the massacres or you were massacred yourself. One such massacre occurred at Nyarubai. On the 12th of April, more than 1,500 Tutsi sought refuge in a Catholic church in Nyangwe, then in Kivumu commune. Local Interahamwe, acting in concert with the authorities, used bulldozers to knock down the church building. The militia used machetes and rifles to kill every person who tried to escape. Local priest Athanase Siromba was later found guilty and sentenced to life in prison by the ICTR for his role in the demolition of his church. He was convicted of the crime of genocide and crimes against humanity in another case. Thousands sought refuge in the official technical school in Kigali where Belgian UNAMIR soldiers were stationed. On the 11th of April, the Belgian soldiers withdrew, and Rwandan armed forces and militia killed all the Tutsi. Sexual violence. Main article: Rape during the Rwandan genocide. Rape was used as a tool by the Interahamwe, the chief perpetrators, to separate the consciously heterogeneous population and to drastically exhaust the opposing group. The use of propaganda played an important role in both the genocide and the gender-specific violence. The Hutu propaganda depicted Tutsi women as a sexually seductive fifth column in league with the Hutus' enemies. The exceptional brutality of the sexual violence, as well as the complicity of Hutu women in the attacks, suggests that the use of propaganda had been effective in the exploitation of gendered needs, which had mobilized both females and males to participate. Soldiers of the Army for the Liberation of Rwanda and the Rwandan Defense Forces, including the Presidential Guard, and civilians also committed rape against mostly Tutsi women. Although Tutsi women were the main targets, moderate Hutu women were also raped. Along with the Hutu moderates, Hutu women who were married to or who hid Tutsis were also targeted. In his 1996 report on Rwanda, the UN Special Rapporteur René Degny-Segui stated, "Rape was the rule and its absence was the exception." He also noted, rape was systematic and was used as a weapon. With this thought and using methods of force and threat, the genocidaires forced others to stand by during rapes. A testimonial by a woman of the name Marie-Louise Niobuhungero recalled seeing local peoples, other generals and Hutu men watching her get raped about 5 times a day. Even when she was kept under watch of a woman, the woman would give no sympathy or help and furthermore forced her to farm land in between rapes. Many of the survivors became infected with HIV from the HIV-infected men recruited by the genocidaires. During the conflict, Hutu extremists released hundreds of patients suffering from AIDS from hospitals and formed them into rape squads. The intent was to infect and cause a slow, inexorable death for their future Tutsi rape victims. 213 Tutsi women were also targeted with the intent of destroying their reproductive capabilities. Sexual mutilation sometimes occurred after the rape and included mutilation of the vagina with machetes, knives, sharpened sticks, boiling water, and acid. Men were also the victims of sexual violation, including public mutilation of the genitals. Some experts have estimated that between 250,000 and 500,000 women were raped during the genocide. Killing of the Twa. The Pygmy people called the Batwa made up about 1% of Rwanda population. A report shows that the group has been described as people who lived in forests and off-lands, but currently the Twa are dispersed in the country in smaller groups while integrating into society. Although the Twa were not directly targeted by the genocidaires, an estimated 10,000 of a population of 30,000 were nonetheless killed. They are sometimes referred to as the forgotten victims of the Rwandan genocide in the months leading up to the genocide. Hutu radio stations accused the Batwa of aiding the RPF, and Twa survivors describe Hutu fighters as threatening to kill them all. Rwandan Patriotic Front's military campaign and victory. Map showing the advance of the RPF during the Rwandan genocide of 1994. On the 7th of April, as the genocide started, RPF commander Paul Kagame warned the Crisis Committee and UNAMIR that he would resume the civil war if the killing did not stop the next day. Rwandan government forces attacked the National Parliament building from several directions. But RPF troops stationed there successfully fought back. The RPF then began an attack from the north on 3 fronts, seeking to link up quickly with the isolated troops in Kigali. Kagame refused to talk to the interim government, believing that it was just a cover for Bagasore's rule and not committed to ending the genocide over the next few days. The RPF advanced steadily south, capturing Gabiro and large areas of the countryside to the north and east of Kigali. They avoided attacking the capital city Kigali or Byumba, but conducted maneuvers designed to encircle the cities and cut off supply routes. The RPF also allowed Tutsi refugees from Uganda to settle behind the front line in the RPF-controlled areas. Throughout April, there were numerous attempts by UNAMIR to establish a ceasefire. But Kagame insisted each time that the RPF would not stop fighting unless the killings stopped. In late April, the RPF secured the whole of the Tanzanian border area and began to move west from Kibungo, to the south of Kigali. They encountered little resistance except around Kigali and Ruhengeri. By the 16th of May, they had cut the road between Kigali and Gitarama, the temporary home of the interim government, and by the 13th of June, had taken Gitarama itself following an unsuccessful attempt by the Rwandan government forces to reopen the road. The interim government was forced to relocate to Gizani in the far northwest. As well as fighting the war, Kagame was recruiting heavily to expand the army. The new recruits included Tutsi survivors of the genocide and refugees from Burundi, but were less well-trained and disciplined than the earlier recruits. Having completed the encirclement of Kigali, the RPF spent the latter half of June fighting for the city itself. The government forces had superior manpower and weapons, but the RPF steadily gained territory as well as conducting raids to rescue civilians from behind enemy lines. According to Dallaire, this success was due to Kagame's being a master of psychological warfare. He exploited the fact that the government forces were concentrating on the genocide rather than the fight for Kigali, and capitalized on the government's loss of morale as it lost territory. The RPF finally defeated the Rwandan government forces in Kigali on the 4th of July, and on the 18th of July took Gizani and the rest of the northwest, forcing the interim government to flee into Zaire and finally ending the genocide. At the end of July 1994, Kagame's forces held the whole of Rwanda except for the zone in the southwest, which had been occupied by a French-led United Nations force as part of Opération Turquoise. The Liberation Day for Rwanda would come to be marked as the 4th of July and is commemorated as a public holiday. Killings by the Rwandan Patriotic Front. See also double genocide theory. During the genocide and in the months following the RPF victory, RPF soldiers killed many people, although the number of casualties is disputed. Alison de Forges was one of the first researchers to conclude that RPF committed atrocities in a systematic fashion that were directed by officers with a high level of authority. She estimated that RPF killed around 30,000 people considered enemies of the Tutsi. Some witnesses blamed Kagame himself for ordering killings. After ICTR investigators reportedly discovered 2 layers of bodies in a mass grave in Kabuya in early 1996, one of Tutsi victims of the genocide and another left by RPF killings of Hutu civilians. Further forensic investigations were prohibited by the Rwandan government. French scholar André Guichewa charged the post-genocide government with deliberate destruction of evidence regarding killings of Hutu to avoid prosecution by the ICTR. Some critics have suggested that these crimes should have been prosecuted by the ICTR, or even amounted to genocide under international law. In contrast, the post-genocide regime maintains that killings by RPF soldiers were perpetrated by undisciplined recruits seeking revenge, and that all such transgressions were promptly punished. The first rumors of RPF killings emerged after 250,000 mostly Hutu refugees streamed into Tanzania at the border crossing of Rusumo on 28 April 1994. The refugees had fled before the Tutsi rebels arrived because they believed the RPF were committing atrocities. A spokesperson for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees observed that, "There's a lot of propaganda by the government radio aimed at the Hutu, which makes them feel very anti-Tutsi." After the RPF took control of the border crossing at Rusumo on 30 April, refugees continued to cross the Kagera River, ending up in remote areas of Tanzania. In early May, the UNHCR began hearing concrete accounts of atrocities and made this information public on 17 May. After the RPF took power in Rwanda, UNHCR sent a team led by Robert Gersony to investigate the prospects for a speedy return of the nearly 2 million refugees that had fled Rwanda since April. After interviewing 300 people, Gersony concluded that, clearly, systematic murders and persecution of the Hutu population in certain parts of the country had taken place. Gersony's findings were suppressed by the United Nations. The Gersony report did not technically exist because Gersony did not complete it. But a summary of an oral presentation of his findings was leaked in 2010. Gersony's personal conclusion was that between April and August 1994, the RPF had killed between 25,000 and 45,000 persons, between 5,000 and 10,000 persons each month from April through July, and 5,000 for the month of August. The new authorities categorically denied the allegations of Gersony, details of which leaked to the press. According to an RPA officer, there was not time to do proper screening. "We needed a force, and some of those recruited were thieves and criminals. Those people have been responsible for much of our trouble today." In an interview with journalist Stephen Kinzer, Kagame acknowledged that killings had occurred, but stated that they were carried out by rogue soldiers and had been impossible to control. The RPF killings gained international attention with the 1995 Kabeo massacre, in which soldiers opened fire on a camp for internally displaced persons in Butare Prefecture. Australian soldiers serving as part of UNAMIR estimated at least 4,000 people were killed, while the Rwandan government claimed that the death toll was 338. International involvement. Main article: International response to the Rwandan genocide. United Nations. Main article: UNAMIR. The building in which 10 Belgian UNAMIR soldiers were massacred and mutilated. Today the site is preserved as a memorial for the soldiers. The United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda had been in Rwanda since October 1993, with a mandate to oversee the implementation of the Arusha Accords. UNAMIR Commander Romeo Dallaire learned of the Hutu power movement during the mission's deployment, as well as plans for the mass extermination of Tutsi. He also became aware of secret weapons caches through an informant, but his request to raid them was turned down by the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations, which felt that Dallaire was exceeding his mandate and had to be kept on a leash. Seizing the weapons was argued to be squarely within UNAMIR's mandate. Both sides had requested UNAMIR, and it had been authorized by the UN Security Council in Resolution 872. UNAMIR's effectiveness in peacekeeping was also hampered by President Habyarimana and Hutu hardliners, and by April 1994, the Security Council threatened to terminate UNAMIR's mandate if it did not make progress. Following the death of Habyarimana and the start of the genocide, Dallaire liaised repeatedly with both the Crisis Committee and the RPF, attempting to re-establish peace and prevent the resumption of the civil war. Neither side was interested in a ceasefire, the government, because it was controlled by the genocidaires, and the RPF because it considered it necessary to fight to stop the killings. UNAMIR's Chapter 6 mandate rendered it powerless to intervene militarily. And most of its Rwandan staff were killed in the early days of the genocide, severely limiting its ability to operate. UNAMIR was therefore largely reduced to a bystander role, and Dallaire later labeled it a failure. Its most significant contribution was to provide refuge for thousands of Tutsi and moderate Hutu at its headquarters in Amahoro Stadium, as well as other secure UN sites, and to assist with the evacuation of foreign nationals. On the 12th of April, the Belgian government, which was one of the largest troop contributors to UNAMIR, and had lost 10 soldiers protecting Prime Minister Awileng Giliimana, announced that it was withdrawing, reducing the force's effectiveness even further. On the 17th of May 1994, the UN passed Resolution 918, which imposed an arms embargo and reinforced UNAMIR, which would be known as UNAMIR II. The new soldiers did not start arriving until June, and following the end of the genocide in July. The role of UNAMIR II was largely confined to maintaining security and stability, until its termination in 1996. France and Opération Turquoise. Main article: Role of France in the Rwandan genocide. French Marine parachutists stand guard at the airport, August 1994. During President Habyarimana's years in power, France maintained close relations with him, as part of its Francafrique policy, and assisted Rwanda militarily against the RPF during the civil war. France considered the RPF, along with Uganda, as part of a plot to increase Anglophone influence at the expense of French influence. During the first few days of the genocide, France launched Amaryllis, a military operation assisted by the Belgian army and UNAMIR, to evacuate expatriates from Rwanda. The French and Belgians refused to allow any Tutsi to accompany them, and those who boarded the evacuation trucks were forced off at Rwandan government checkpoints, where they were killed. The French also separated several expatriates and children from their Tutsi spouses, rescuing the foreigners but leaving the Rwandans to likely death. They rescued several high-profile members of Habyarimana's government, as well as his wife Agatha. In late June 1994, France launched Opération Turquoise, an unmandated mission to create safe humanitarian areas for displaced persons, refugees, and civilians in danger. From bases in the Zairian cities of Goma and Bukavu, the French entered southwestern Rwanda and established the Zone Turquoise, within the Cyangugu-Kabuya-Gikongoro Triangle, an area occupying approximately a fifth of Rwanda. Radio France International estimates that Turquoise saved around 15,000 lives, but with the genocide coming to an end and the RPF's ascendancy, many Rwandans interpreted Turquoise as a mission to protect Hutu from the RPF. Including some who had participated in the genocide. The French remained hostile to the RPF, and their presence temporarily stalled the RPF's advance. A number of inquiries have been held into French involvement in Rwanda, including the 1998 French Parliamentary Commission on Rwanda, which accused France of errors of judgment, including military cooperation against a background of ethnic tensions, massacres and violence, but did not accuse France of direct responsibility for the genocide itself. 281. A 2008 report by the Rwandan government-sponsored Museo Commission accused the French government of knowing of preparations for the genocide and helping to train Hutu militia members. In 2019, President Macron decided to reopen the issue of French involvement in the genocide by commissioning a new team to sort through the state archives. In April 2021, the Rwandan government announced the study they had commissioned alleged France did nothing to prevent what they deemed the foreseeable April and May 1994 massacres in the genocide. United States. Convoy of American military vehicles bring fresh water from Goma to Rwandan refugees located at Camp Kimbumba, Zaire in August 1994. Intelligence reports indicate that United States President Bill Clinton and his cabinet were aware before the height of the massacre that a deliberate and systematic genocide to eliminate all Tutsis was planned. Fear of a repeat of the events in Somalia shaped U.S. policy at the time, with many commentators identifying the graphic consequences of the Battle of Mogadishu as the key reason behind the U.S.'s failure to intervene in later conflicts such as the Rwandan genocide. After the battle, the bodies of several U.S. casualties of the conflict were dragged through the streets of Mogadishu by crowds of local civilians and members of ID's Somali National Alliance. According to the former U.S. Deputy Special Envoy to Somalia, Walter Clark, the ghosts of Somalia continue to haunt U.S. policy. Our lack of response in Rwanda was a fear of getting involved in something like a Somalia all over again. President Clinton has referred to the failure of the U.S. government to intervene in the genocide as one of his main foreign policy failings, saying, "I don't think we could have ended the violence, but I think we could have cut it down, and I regret it." 80% of the discussion in Washington concerned the evacuation of American citizens. Arms sales to Rwanda. In her 2004 book, Linda Melbourne documented that, in the 3 years from October 1990, Rwanda, one of the poorest countries in the world, became the third largest importer of weapons in Africa, spending an estimated $112 million United States dollars. She cited a significant contract with Egypt in 1992, and with France and South Africa, the next year. Before the international embargo against Rwanda on the 17th of May 1994, South Africa and France were two of the main suppliers of arms to Rwanda. According to Human Rights Watch, after the embargo, they diverted their arms trade through Goma Airport in Zaire. Zaire played a key role in supplying arms and facilitating arms flows to the Rwandan army. Some officials also encouraged arms trafficking by private dealers. In 2017, according to Haaretz, Israel or Israeli private arms dealers had sold arms to the Rwandan government. Israeli officials repeatedly denied this allegation. In 2016, a petition was submitted to the Israeli Supreme Court, which ruled that the records which document Israel's arms sales, notably to Rwanda, will remain sealed, citing Section 9 of Israel's Freedom of Information Act, which allows for non-disclosure if in releasing the information there is a concern over harming national security, its foreign relations, the security of its public or the security or well-being of an individual. Catholic Church. A memorial in a Catholic church. Pope John Paul II expressed his deep concern about what was happening in April 1994. On the 9th of April, in a message to Rwandan Catholics, he urged them not to give way to feelings of hatred and revenge but to courageously practice dialogue and forgiveness. The Catholic Church affirms that genocide took place but states that those who took part in it did so without the permission of the Church. Though religious factors were not prominent, in its 1999 report Human Rights Watch faulted a number of religious authorities in Rwanda, including Catholics, Anglicans and other Protestant denominations, for failing to condemn the genocide, though that accusation was belied over time. Many other clergymen gave their lives to prevent Tutsis from being killed. Some clergy participated in the massacres. Catholic nuns Maria Kisito and Gertrude Mukanongo were convicted in 2001 of involvement in the murders of 500,700 Tutsis, who had sought refuge at their convent in Sovu. Witnesses testified that they had directed a death squad to the victims' hiding place and had given them petrol with which to burn down the building. In 2006, Father Athanase Siromba was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda for his role in the massacre of 2,000 Tutsis. The court heard that Siromba lured the Tutsis to the church, where they believed they would find refuge. When they arrived, he ordered that bulldozers should be used to crush the refugees, who were hiding inside the church, and if any of them were still alive, Hutu militias should kill them all. Some in the Catholic Church's religious hierarchy were later tried and convicted for their participation in the genocide by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Bishop Masago was accused of corruption and complicity in the genocide, but he was cleared of all charges in 2000. On the 20th of March 2017, Pope Francis acknowledged that while some Catholic nuns and priests in the country were killed during the genocide, others were complicit in it and took part in preparing and executing the genocide. Aftermath: Katali refugee camp, Zaire 1994. Hutu refugees particularly entered the eastern portion of Zaire. Hutu genocidaires began to regroup in refugee camps along the border with Rwanda. Declaring a need to avert further genocide, the RPF-led government made military incursions into Zaire, resulting in the first 1996-97 and second 1998-2003 Congo Wars. Armed struggles between the Rwandan government and their opponents in the DRC have continued through battles of proxy militias in the Goma region, including the M23 rebellion 2012-2013. Large Rwandan Hutu and Tutsi populations continue to live as refugees throughout the region. Refugee crisis, insurgency, and two Congo wars. Main articles: Great Lakes refugee crisis, First Congo War, and Second Congo War. View of refugee camp on foggy day, showing tents of various colors and the refugees. Kimbumba refugee camp in Goma, Zaire. Following the RPF victory, approximately 2 million Hutu fled to refugee camps in neighboring countries, particularly Zaire, fearing RPF reprisals for the Rwandan genocide. The camps were crowded and squalid, and thousands of refugees died in disease epidemics, including cholera and dysentery. The camps were set up by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, but were effectively controlled by the army and government of the former Hutu regime, including many leaders of the genocide, who began rearming in a bid to return to power in Rwanda. By late 1996, Hutu militants from the camps were launching regular cross-border incursions, and the RPF-led Rwandan government launched a counteroffensive. Rwanda provided troops and military training to the Banyamulenge, a Tutsi group in the Zairian South Kivu province, helping them to defeat Zairian security forces. Rwandan forces, the Banyamulenge, and other Zairian Tutsi, then attacked the refugee camps, targeting the Hutu militia. These attacks caused hundreds of thousands of refugees to flee. Many returned to Rwanda despite the presence of the RPF, while others ventured further west into Zaire. The refugees fleeing further into Zaire were relentlessly pursued by the RPA under the cover of the AFDL rebellion, and 232,000 Hutu refugees were killed, according to one estimate. The defeated forces of the former regime continued a cross-border insurgency campaign, supported initially by the predominantly Hutu population of Rwanda northwestern prefectures. By 1999, a program of propaganda and Hutu integration into the national army succeeded in bringing the Hutu to the government side, and the insurgency was defeated. In addition to dismantling the refugee camps, Kagame began planning a war to remove longtime dictator Mobutu Sese Seko from power. Mobutu had supported the genocidaires based in the camps, and was also accused of allowing attacks on Tutsi people within Zaire together with Uganda. The Rwandan government supported an alliance of 4 rebel groups headed by Laurent Désiré Kabila, which began waging the First Congo War in 1996. The rebels quickly took control of the North and South Kivu provinces and later advanced west, gaining territory from the poorly organized and demotivated Zairian army. With little fighting, and controlling the whole country by 1997, Mobutu fled into exile, and Zaire was renamed the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Rwanda fell out with the new Congolese government in 1998, and Kagame supported a fresh rebellion, leading to the Second Congo War, which would last up until 2003 and caused millions of deaths and massive damage. In 2010, a United Nations report accused the Rwandan army of committing wide-scale human rights violations and crimes against humanity in the Congo during those wars, charges denied by the Rwandan government. According to A. Dirk Moses and 2 other scholars, Rwanda as well as Israel are the main states, citing a traumatic past. to challenge the injunction against violent territorial expansion, under the guise of preventing future atrocities. Domestic situation. Graph showing the population of Rwanda from 1961 to 2003. The infrastructure and economy of the country had suffered greatly during the genocide. Many buildings were uninhabitable, and the former regime had carried with them all currency and movable assets when they fled the country. Human resources were also severely depleted, with over 40% of the population having been killed or fled. Many of the remainder were traumatized, most had lost relatives, witnessed killings or participated in the genocide. The long-term effects of war rape in Rwanda for the victims include social isolation, sexually transmitted diseases, unwanted pregnancies and babies, with some women resorting to self-induced abortions. The army, led by Paul Kagame, maintained law and order while the government began the work of rebuilding the country's structures. Non-governmental organizations began to move back into the country, but the international community did not provide significant assistance to the new government, and most international aid was routed to the refugee camps, which had formed in Zaire following the exodus of Hutu from Rwanda. Kagame strove to portray the new government as inclusive and not Tutsi-dominated. He directed the removal of ethnicity from Rwandan citizens' national identity cards, and the government began a policy of downplaying the distinctions between Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa. Justice system after genocide. The systematic destruction of the judicial system during the genocide and civil war was a major problem. After the genocide, over 1 million people were potentially culpable for a role in the genocide. The RPF pursued a policy of mass arrests for those responsible and for those persons who took part in the genocide, jailing over 100,000 people in the 2 years after the genocide. The pace of arrests overwhelmed the physical capacity of the Rwandan prison system, leading to what Amnesty International deemed cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment. The country's 19 prisons were designed to hold about 18,000 inmates total. But at their peak in 1998 there were over 100,000 people in crowded detention facilities across the country. Government institutions, including judicial courts, were destroyed, and many judges, prosecutors, and employees were murdered during the genocide. Of Rwanda's 750 judges, 506 did not remain after the genocide. Many were murdered and most of the survivors fled Rwanda. By 1997, Rwanda only had 50 lawyers in its judicial system. These barriers caused the trials to proceed very slowly, with 130,000 suspects held in Rwandan prisons after the genocide. 3,343 cases were handled between 1996 and the end of 2000. Of those defendants, 20% received death sentences, 32% received life in prison, and 20% were acquitted. It was calculated that it would take over 200 years to conduct the trials of the suspects in prison, not including the ones who remained at large. The RPF government began the long-awaited genocide trials, which had an uncertain start at the end of 1996 and inched forward in 1997. It was not until 1996 that courts finally began trials for genocide cases with the enactment of Organic Law No. 0896 of 30 on 30 August 1996. This law initiated the prosecution of genocide, crimes committed during the genocide and of crimes against humanity from October 1990. This law established the regular domestic courts as the core mechanism for responding to genocide until it was amended in 2001 to include the Gacaca courts. The Organic Law established 4 categories for those who were involved in the genocide, specifying the limits of punishment for members of each category. The first category was reserved those who were planners, organizers, instigators, supervisors and leaders of the genocide, and any who used positions of state authority to promote the genocide. This category also applied to murderers who distinguished themselves on the basis of their zeal or cruelty, or who engaged in sexual torture. Members of this first category were eligible for the death sentence. To be continued. Thank you for watching. Like and share so more people understand our history not to repeat itself.